Now, the problem with that is the word optimal, which it turns out to be pretty hard in practice to know how to do this. So there's some problems with determining the optimal level of price regulation. In particular, to do this, the government needs to know two things. First, it needs to know the demand curve, which turns out to be pretty hard to measure. Turns out to be pretty hard to measure. In a competitive market, we can measure demand curves based on what people are willing to pay. But in a market like a public utility, there's no price variation allowing us to measure demand curves. So we have to move to the kind of alternative methods we talked about earlier in this course. Okay? One alternative method is asking people, what are you willing to pay to get water to your house? The method we call contingent valuation. It's a fancy name economists use for asking people. We call it contingent valuation because contingent means you're asking to value something that you might not have experienced. Contingent means it might happen. And that turns out to be hard. And I've talked about this before. But if you ask folks what stuff is worth they haven't experienced, they give silly answers. So for example, if you ask folks what they would pay to save the Grand Canyon, if you place that as the first question in a survey, and then you re-ask the survey where it's the third question, people are willing to pay 5 times as much to save the Grand Canyon when it's the first question asked as opposed to the third question asked. That makes no sense. If you ask people how much they'll pay to save birds, they will pay the same amount to save 200 birds, 2,000 birds, or 20,000 birds. That makes no sense. So stuff like that, basically, it's hard to ask people these questions. These are hard things to answer. What's the Grand Canyon worth to you? I got no idea. Okay, these are hard things to answer. The other way we talked about, if you remember the gas price example from the second lecture, we talked about valuing people's time through what we called revealed preference approaches, which is you can get people to take actions that reveal what things are worth to them. And with the gas price example, we showed how we could use that to value people's time. That may work, but it may not. So the bottom line is it's sometimes hard to get these demand curves. But that is child's play compared to measuring the supply curve. Why is that? Because the only way to get the supply curve is to have the firm tell you, okay? And the firm has no incentive to be honest. So if I go to a firm and I say, hey, Joe, I'm going to regulate you based on your costs. So the higher your costs, the higher price I'll let you charge. So what are your costs again? Oh, God, you wouldn't believe how expensive my costs are. Okay? Basically, firms have every incentive to lie. And the problem is firms know a ton more about their costs than do regulators. Okay? It's incredibly hard. These are incredibly complicated businesses. It's incredibly hard to get in and figure out what costs are. So as a result, while we have some methods for getting demand curve, at least consumers have no incentive to lie, firms have an incentive to lie, and it's going to be very hard to measure the supply curve. As a result, optimal price regulation might be quite difficult. The problem is, if you get price regulation right, you can make things better. But if you get it wrong, you can make things worse. So for example, imagine that I said, gee, I think you're lying about costs. I think costs are much lower. I think that you can actually produce at a price of 10. So I'm going to set the price ceiling at 10. Well, what does that do to the firm? Well, at a price of 10, okay, at a marginal cost of 10, okay, that is so low that that's below the firm's marginal revenue. That's below the firm's marginal revenue curve. So the firm would just say, look, I'm just going to produce where price equals marginal cost. It doesn't matter, I'm a monopolist. That's such a low price. I'm only going to produce where price equals marginal cost. So at a price of 10, I'm just going to produce 5 units. I'm not going to really pay attention to my marginal revenue curve because that's so low. It's just going to be, my new marginal revenue curve is just going to be a flat line at 10. The flat line at 10 intersects marginal cost at a quantity of 5. I'm going to produce 5. Well, if the monopolist produces 5, okay, what happens to surplus? Well, you're way worse than you were in the monopoly case. In the monopoly case, you just lost C plus E. If the monopolist produces 5, you now lose C plus E plus F plus G plus H. Surplus has shrunk to A plus B plus D plus I. So you now lose, with a monopoly only, with the government staying out of its way, you lost C plus E. Now, with the government setting a price ceiling at 10, you lose C plus E plus F plus G plus H. That's all gone. So you've made things worse, not better by regulating. If you set it right, we can recapture C plus E. If you set it wrong, we could lose even more. And indeed, you could set it badly enough, the monopolist says, screw it, I'm not producing at all, and the whole market shuts down, then all the surplus is gone. Okay, you could actually set it below the marginal cost. Okay, now that is not going to be true in this example, given that MC equals 2Q. But in other examples, you could set it so low that the firm might actually just shut down. So this is a case where the government can make things better, but might make things worse. Okay, and that's how we think about the optimal regulation of these kinds of natural monopolies. A really interesting case to think about that's more relevant, you guys don't think much about water, but you think a lot about broadband. So let's think about optimal regulation of broadband. Here's an interesting different case. Okay? So basically, currently, anyone who wants to deliver broadband to your house has to go and lay a new set of lines to do so. Now, this is not as expensive as doing new water pipes. This is done. There are many, many parallel sets of these broadband lines running down the street. So it's not infeasible. It's very expensive, but it's not prohibitively expensive. Okay? Nonetheless, it's expensive enough that there's very limited competition in broadband services in the US. Because it's a high enough fixed cost. You know, so if you go back to figure 15.1, you can think of that curve as declining and eventually crossing the marginal cost curve. But at such a high quantity that it still prohibits competition. Okay? There's some competition, but it's pretty limited. In Europe, they do it very differently. In Europe, they say that the lines in the ground are public. So the lines in the ground are public. And firms compete to send content over those lines. So that actually, there's no fixed cost to setting up a new broadband delivery. The fixed cost of advertising or whatever and getting your name out there. But you don't have to lay a new set of lines. So you can drive competition down to the marginal cost. You have much more effective, it's much easier to enter and become a new broadband delivery service in Europe. Because you just pay the marginal cost of sending it out over the lines. You don't have to lay the lines anywhere. Those are public utility. So that's an alternative way you can do government regulation to essentially try to deal with this more effectively. Okay? Questions about that? Okay, so these are kind of roles the government can play to try to deal with the fact that in some cases monopolies make sense. Like if it's a natural monopoly, it makes sense. If there's a patent that can really increase demand, it makes sense. But that doesn't mean the government has to take it lying down. The government, even in a case where monopoly makes sense, the government can still come in and do some good, ideally, in regulating that monopoly.